Well, a long time ago, there were two twin brothers who were born to the same family. And these brothers, from the very beginning, had a bit of a rivalry going on. We are told that when they were born, one was born first, and the second one was clutching at his brother's ankle as he was born. And that rivalry, if you're picking up on the story, familiar with some of your Old Testament, that rivalry continued for a long time. Up into their teenage years, their young adult years, there was always this feud that seemed to kind of be going on between these two brothers. And that feud would live on beyond their lifetime. With their descendants long after these brothers had passed away, their descendants carried on that feud, that rivalry that had begun so long ago. It was, if you want to, it was one of the first family feuds, not like the fun, like high-energy game show that we've got today, but there was some duking it out that took place. And this morning, I share that with you because we're starting a new short series. We're starting a series that we're calling One-Hit Wonders. And you've probably heard the saying, you maybe said it before, you can't judge a book by its cover. Good, we're all on the same page. Well, in this series, we're going to use the saying, you can't judge a book by its chapter count. All right, because in this short series, we're going to be looking at what we're calling the one-hit wonders of the Bible. Those short books of the Bible that are just one chapter. So this morning we're going to be kicking the series off with the book of Obadiah, Old Testament. If you've been here throughout the year, we've already been kind of doing this series. Back in the fall, we studied the book of Jude together, which is near the end of the New Testament, one of those obscure one-chapter books. We studied that. The beginning of summer, we took some time and studied the book of Philemon, and that's another one chapter. And through this series, the next 3 weeks, we're going to look at the rest of the one-chapter books of the Bible. Today, Obadiah, and then 2nd and 3rd John in the next couple weeks. And I really believe that as we dig into these books, we're going to find that while they're short, there's a lot of great stuff packed in them. There's a lot of great things to learn. And I don't know about you and how familiar you are with the book of Obadiah, but I wasn't all that familiar with the book of Obadiah before this week. And so I've learned some good things, and hopefully we'll get to learn some great things as we study it together. So Obadiah, just to give you some context, is considered one of the 12 minor prophets in the Bible. Now, if you're saying minor prophets, is there a majors, right? You were thinking minor leagues, major leagues. We've got the minor prophets and we have the major prophets. And the difference between them is not like the MLB system where it's like you've got the best in the majors and you've got those that are, well, they're good, but they're up and coming. And the minors, the difference biblically between the major prophets and minor prophets is just that, well, the major ones are a lot longer. They had a lot more to say. The minor prophets are pretty short. And so Obadiah is considered the most minor of the minor prophets because it's short, sweet, to the point, but it packs a great punch. And so we don't know much about who Obadiah was. We don't really know anything about Obadiah, except for that God saw fit to give him a vision. And in this vision, God communicated, wow, that was a word jumble. God communicated a couple of things through him. Number one, he communicated the condemnation of Edom. And Edom, just to give you some historical context, is Esau's descendants. So the story that I was alluding to a couple minutes ago about the two twin brothers who were born, Jacob and Esau, Edom would be Esau's descendants. They came down the line. And while there's a condemnation for them, on the flip side of it, Obadiah shares a confirmation of Jacob's or Israel's coming success. And so just to give you a quick outline of the book of Obadiah, if you're there, look at it with me. I'm going to give you a snapshot of where we're going. In verses 1 through 9, we're going to see what is going to happen to Edom. This is God saying, here's what's coming. Here's what's going to happen to you. In verses 2 through 4, you guys are going to be humbled. In verses 5 and 6, you're going to be plundered rather extensively. In verse 7, your allies will turn against you. In verses 8 and 9, the end of the story is you're going to be destroyed. Pretty harsh pretty harsh words to come for you. Not a great way to start the book. But God backs it up in some ways here in verses 10 through 14. The next section, which is outlining the charges that's brought against it. Here's why. Here's all these things that God's going to do to this group of people. Here's why he's going to do them. And we're going to find that charges are brought against them for being indifferent to Jacob's distress, being glad to witness his distress, and then taking advantage of it, and then actively betraying the people that descended from Jacob. And in essence, what we see, and we'll unpack this, is that what will happen to Edom follows the age-old principle of you reap what you sow. We'll see that in essence, what Edom did is what Edom will get. And that's what God is going to communicate. Then the final section of the book, the last third of the book, speaks about the coming day of the Lord. And if you've been part of any sort of discussions where we dive into biblical prophecy like these in Obadiah, you've probably heard us talk about the prophetic foreshadowing, in which it's like you go out to the mountains. We had some of our own that were out in the Rockies this last week. Jealous, just going to say that. But when you go out to the mountains, you may look and you see a peak. And then you can look and see beyond that peak, and you see another higher peak, and what you don't see is all the valley and everything that happens in between those two peaks. And so when we look at the coming day of the Lord that Obadiah speaks of, there's a nearsighted peak that is going to be the destruction and suffering of Edom. And then there's a far-sighted peak that is the final day of the Lord that I believe Obadiah also speaks to as well. And so we'll dig into some of those things as we get along. But this morning, I want to look at this book under this idea that for us today, in view of especially that coming day of the Lord, that Obadiah's message for us is to take pause and to have a bit of a heart check. Where are we at? And we need to ask some questions of ourselves, and we need to do so in some ways examining our hearts through the lens of Edom and what has happened to them. And so the first point in this, the first checkpoint in our heart check is to expose our haughtiness. Okay, if we're going to check our hearts today in consistency with the message of Obadiah, we need to expose our haughtiness. All right, for Edom's sake, let's talk about them for a moment. When the word of the Lord came against Edom, it came with a crushing blow. And the crushing blow was everything that you are taking pride in is going to come crumbling down. And the things that they take pride in, if you follow along with me here, are number one, their land and their home. This is where we live. They had a pride in their homeland. And we see that come out in verse 3, especially where it talks about how you who live in the clefts of the rock, in your lofty dwelling, you who say in your heart, who will bring me down to the ground? Verse 4, though you soar aloft like the eagle, though your nest is among the stars, from there will I bring you down. In essence, Edom's haughtiness, their pride, because look where we're at. Nobody can we live in a fortress, a natural fortress of rocky hills and mountains. Nobody can come against us. We are safe. We are secure. And God's saying, hey, listen, hold on. Before you take so much pride in that, let's see what I have to say about it. The second area of their haughtiness comes in their possessions. In verses 5 and 6, we see God bring to the awareness of this plundering. He says, if thieves came to you, if plunderers came by night, how you've been destroyed. Would they not steal only enough for themselves? It says, if grape gatherers came to you, would they not leave gleanings? And then verse 6, how Esau has been pillaged, his treasures sought out. Saying, listen, you've got this great, safe, and secure place to live, and in it you've got these storehouses that you have packed jam full of resources that they are going to provide for you for years to come, and you're doing good. God's saying, hold on, not so fast. Third, their relationships or their alliances. Starting in verse 7, he says that all your allies have driven you to your border. Those at peace with you have deceived you. They have prevailed against you. Those who eat your bread have set a trap beneath you. You have no understanding. We've got great relationships. We know people. We've got allies that are strong. So not only are we good on our own, but we're even better together. And God's saying, listen, your allies are going to turn against you. Those relationships that you've got great stock in, those will not last you. And finally, God addresses their own physical and mental strength in verses 8 and 9. Will I not on that day, declares the Lord, destroy the wise men out of Edom, and understanding out of Mount Esau. And your mighty men shall be dismayed, O Teman, so that every man from Mount Esau will be cut off by slaughter. You wise and mighty people, God's got something coming. So in essence, what God is saying, you think you're something because of all these things. You people of Edom, you look at your home, you look at your possessions, you look at your relationships, you look at your own might, your own strength, your own humanity, and you say, based on all of these things, man, we are it. We're good. We're strong. Nobody can come against us. And what God's saying is, I'm going to bring all those things low. And God's message in essence, I'm going to bring destruction to your home. I'm going to bring desolation to your storehouses. I'm going to bring desertion to those alliances, and I'm going to bring dismay to all of your strength and everything that you've got on your back to say, look at us. It's a harsh word. And in it, God is confronting all of these foundations built by man on which this group of people are going to stand. And before we jump in and say, man, if those things are all the things that Edom had going for themselves, and they took such pride and haughtiness in that, then they probably had it coming for them. I mean, after all, doesn't Proverbs 16 say that pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall? We know we're not supposed to be prideful. We shouldn't be haughty. If they're living that way, then, well, the word of God's true. Their fall is coming. And I want to just say, I recognize that, but watch your step there, friend. Watch your step. Because it's easy to, from the outside looking in, look at a people like Edom, say, man, you guys had it all wrong. When if we're really honest with ourselves, what Obadiah's message is for us today is to just pause and expose our own haughtiness. Because if we define what haughtiness is, let's be honest, it's a little bit more than just pride. It kind of takes pride and builds on it a little bit. Haughtiness is an attitude within your heart that leads you to look down on other people, to think less of others. And maybe it's because we may have haughtiness because of the things like Edom did, because of the place we live, where we're from. And we may not explicitly think that. We may not explicitly articulate those things. But if we took a moment to examine our hearts, maybe there's a little bit of something there because we live somewhere that someone else doesn't. And maybe in a non-confrontational way, like, hey, it's pretty great living in a small town in the middle of rural Illinois. I love that. And those people who live in the cities, I don't know. It doesn't seem so serious. But if we start to look down on others, maybe we have a haughtiness for some of these other reasons, but what if we at the outset of this say, look, those people of Edom had it coming because they were so prideful. Can we heed Paul's word in 1 Corinthians where he says, if anyone thinks he stand, take heed lest he fall. The second we, down our big nose, cast some judgment on Edom and say, watch your step, because you might just be walking into the trap of haughtiness. I would never think like that. I wouldn't. I don't. How could they? Watch your heart that you don't slip into a spirit of haughtiness. So we might find ourselves being haughty because of the things that we have that others don't have. Maybe you will find yourself being haughty because of the things that you do that other people don't do. Or on the flip side of that, the things I don't do that other people are doing. And we can look at other people's lives, and the heart of haughtiness is one of pride and arrogance, because the heart of it is very centered around me. Me versus them. What am I doing that they're not? What do I have that they don't? What do I not do that they do? Right? And we begin to compare, and that instills in us a seed of I am better than so-and-so. Could be an individual, could be a group of people. I am better because of these things. And the spirit of haughtiness and Obadiah's message say we need to expose it for what it is. We need to call it out and understand what it may be. So for us today, maybe you take pride in where you live. Maybe you take pride in your work. You run your own company. You've hit that milestone. You've hit that achievement. You're good at what you do. I am good, and they're just not at my level. Maybe you have pride in how much you've set aside for retirement one day. You're saying, hey, my storehouses are full. I'm feeling pretty good about where I'm going to be. I feel like we're going to have a great life when we can be done working because we've been able to store up a lot. We've got pride because of our connections or our friends. I know people, and it's not just that I know people, but you know what I mean. I know people, like the important people. I got connections in high places, and I'll be fine. I'm okay because if I ever get in trouble, I've got someone's number that I can call. We may find pride in ourselves because our skill sets, our experience, our degrees, our knowledge, you fill in the blank. All of these things, friends, I'm just asking you here and now to pause for a moment. Are you placing your stake on those things? They're not that firm of a foundation as you think they are. And Edom is going to be an example of that. You think you're good. You think you're somebody because of these things, the kingdoms that you've built. And God says, not so fast. I can bring low what you have built high. And the Bible speaks a lot to our pride. It speaks a lot to the things that we take pride in. To go a couple of verses for you that are up on the screen. Proverbs 16, pride goes before destruction. A haughty spirit before a fall. We talked about that. James 4:6. God opposes the proud, but shows favor to the humble. Proverbs 8. God hates pride and arrogance. Isaiah 2. The Lord Almighty has a day in store for all the proud and lofty, for all that's exalted, and they will be humbled. So friends, whether it's today or in eternity, when you have built your life on your own kingdoms and the things that you have built up, one day, God will bring them low. If it's not here in this life, it will be when you stand before the King on that day, the day of judgment. Well, he will say, hey, what's the account for your life? Well, man, I busted my tail day in and day out to provide for my family. Okay. I built up a great retirement. I left fortunes for my kids when I died. Okay. I worked hard to be the very best at what I did. I wanted to be better than every single other person. I wanted to outperform. I wanted to achieve the highest achievements that I could in my field of work or in my expertise or in my hobby. Okay. Guys, one day these things will be brought low. Work hard, dedicate yourself to these things, but don't build your life on them. Because one day, you're going to stand before the King, and the question that he's going to ask is, what did you do with Jesus? And the rest of that stuff, if you say, well, I did, I built, I achieved, it's not going to measure up. What things are you putting your pride in today? So I challenge you on the outset of this to expose your own haughtiness. What are the things in your life that causes you to look down on other people? Not just things you're like, I dedicate myself to work hard, but you look down on people because of it. Is it something that you do, a lifestyle that you live? Is it some achievement that you've done? What is it for you? What is it for you that builds haughtiness in your heart? The scriptures say if we were to boast in anything, we should boast in what? the Lord. We boast in the Lord. These things will not be our call on that day. And so we move from there, and we're going to see that Edom's haughtiness, their pride in these things, and they're staking their life on it, moves them to some action. So our second thing that we're going to examine in our heart check is to examine our heartlessness. So we expose our haughtiness, then we examine our heartlessness, and that sounds like a pretty heavy term. But the first crime that we see brought against Edom, if you look over at verse 10 and 11, well, number one, he says, because of, right, this is verse 10, because of the violence done to your brother Jacob, shame shall cover you, and you shall be cut off forever. And then verse 11, here's what the specific charge is. On the day that you stood aloof, on the day that strangers carried off his wealth and foreigners entered his gates and cast lots for Jerusalem. He's like, look, when trouble came on Jacob, you stood aloof. And that's a fun word to use. Start using it in your regular vocabulary. Aloof, meaning, hey, you know what? You stood opposite, and in essence, you're saying, I see what's happening, and I'm choosing to remain indifferent. I'm just going to stand here. I'm going to let it be what it's going to be. I just don't care. I don't care. But in God's courtroom, indifference is not neutrality. We tend to think, if I'm going to stand indifferent and observe something happening that ought not to be happening, it may be some injustice, whatever it may be, we say, I'm going to remain neutral. God says there is no neutral party when these things are happening. If you know about it, you're in the game. You're picking a side one way or the other. Because notice the end of verse 11. You stood aloof, you stood in the day when strangers carried it all off, and he says what? And you were like one of them. Well, wait a second. We didn't do anything in that day. We just watched. He's like, you're as good as guilty because you saw what was happening and you chose to remain indifferent. Neutrality is not a thing in the courtroom of God. We love to build middle grounds. We like to put in neutral spaces. We like to build in the gray areas because why? Those are comfortable places to be. Because it doesn't demand anything of you. You can say, I'm going to sit here and I don't have to engage. I don't have to fight back. I can just be. But guys, you're not truly being neutral in these circumstances. Why? Well, number one, I want to get into it. Being indifferent, taking that position, is not loving your neighbor. When you see something, Edom watched as Jacob was attacked by strangers. Their stuff was plundered. They're just observing and saying, man, what a rough day. Rough day. But the scriptures say that that's not the way that we are called to love our neighbor. You think New Testament, right? Parable of the Good Samaritan. Everyone familiar with Parable of the Good Samaritan? Okay, let's relive it for a second. Jesus says there's a man who's traveling down by this road and a band of robbers come and they beat this man. And they steal everything that he has and they leave him for dead on the side of the road. And what happens? Well, while he's laying there for dead, a priest comes and he walks by and he sees the man laying on the road, left for dead, and says, ooh, rough day. Passes by on the other side. Well, later a Levite comes by and he likewise sees the man laying on the side of the road and says, rough fortunes today. Passes by on the other side. Lastly, a Samaritan. Oil and water, those Jews and Samaritans. A Samaritan walks by and he sees the man and he has pity on him. And he shows him mercy. And he binds his wounds, he throws him on his donkey, he takes him to an inn, he provides for his needs, and he cares for this man. And the question Jesus says is, who loved their neighbor? The man who showed mercy. So in Jesus' courtroom, walking by on the other side is the easy thing. Getting your hands dirty and caring for people is the hard thing. But that's loving your neighbor. And in Jesus' example, he masterfully wove it in because those two individuals, the priest and the Levite, would have had 100 good excuses to do exactly what they did. I can't touch this man, I'll be unclean. I've got services to do. I've got business to conduct. I've got a reputation to uphold. Whatever it may be. They had 100 valid excuses they could have thrown at it. And Jesus says, did they love their neighbor? No. This other man did. So choosing to remain indifferent is not loving your neighbor. Secondly, it's a conscious decision. You don't just meander your way in to being indifferent. There's a difference between indifference and ignorance. Okay, ignorance is I'm not doing because I don't know. Indifference says I know and I'm not doing because I don't want to. That's the difference. And the Bible calls us as God's people, it recognizes that there may be times where we have ignorance. And there's grace for ignorance. But it calls us to action, not indifference. Notice Proverbs 24, it says, rescue those who are being taken away to death. Hold back those who are stumbling to the slaughter. So here's the scenario. It's saying, we see what's happening. We know that these people are taking away to death. Rescue them. You see it, act. You hold back those who are stumbling to the slaughter. You know where they're headed. Do something. Engage. If you say, behold, we did not know this, I'm claiming ignorance. He says, does not he who weighs the heart perceive it? Does not he who keeps watch over your soul know it? And will he not repay man according to his work? In essence, what Proverbs is saying is, great. If you want to claim ignorance, you better be ignorant, because God knows your heart. And you may fool your neighbor, but you're not going to fool God. So in God's courtroom, again, you see those who are being taken away to death. You see those who are stumbling to the slaughter. It's time to step in the game. There's no indifference. You can choose to be indifferent, and it says, will God not repay man according to his work? That's Edom's story, friends. You watch while Jacob is being destroyed, and you remained indifferent. You did not rescue. You did not hold back. You just let happen. There's a conscious decision that takes place to say, I see what's happening. I am choosing to not engage. I am choosing to remain neutral, which, let's call a spade a spade. You're choosing to be against it. That's the harsh reality. You reap what you sow is the story and the principle that's true for Edom, and it's true biblically even for us. So Christian, follower of Christ, you see it, you can choose to turn the blind eye or to engage. You will reap what you sow when it comes to these things. Last part of this, indifference does not remain inactive. It won't remain inactive. You think, I'm just going to step back and let it happen. Well, maybe that's where Edom was at, but they moved in that. Their indifference developed. And notice it's the progression of their heartlessness here. In verse 11, they stood by and they watched Edom be destroyed. In that day you stood aloof. And so they started there and they were indifferent in their observation. We're just going to watch this happen. And then verse 12, we're told, then they do not gloat over the day of your brother and the day of his misfortune. Don't rejoice over the people of Judah in the day of their ruin. Don't boast in the day of distress. So their indifference moved from, I'm just going to sit back and watch, to now they're finding some level of satisfaction, some joy, some happiness in seeing what's happening. It's not just, oh, that stinks. It's kind of like, hey, that's a good thing. Man, look what's happening to Jacob these days. Man, brutal. That's pretty. You're like, they had it coming, about time. It becomes more of a celebration. Third, in verse 13, then we see, do not enter the gate of my people in the day of their calamity. Don't gloat over his disaster in the day of his calamity. Don't loot his wealth in the day of his calamity. And we see from there, now that their heartlessness moves from saying, I'm just going to watch, to, oh, I'm kind of enjoying this, to, I'm going to participate in this. And Edom is brought to charge in the fact that in Jacob's distress, in their day of calamity, they went and they took an opportunity. They said, in this opportunity, I want to participate in this, and they loot. So, oh, well, it's open for the taking. I might as well. Who am I to turn up an open opportunity? So that indifference grows. And then lastly, down in verse 14, we see, do not stand at the crossroads to cut off his fugitives, and do not hand over his survivors in the day of distress. It finally progressed to the point of saying, I'm going to take a proactive engagement in this. I'm not just going to seize an opportunity. Now I'm going to go and look for opportunity. That's how their indifference progressed. I'm just going to stand and watch. So, not that bad. Okay, I'll participate. So I'm going to go seek it out. I'm going to go make it happen. So we ought to be careful as followers of Christ in those areas where we say, I'm going to just sit on the sideline. I'm not going to stand here and say it's a foregone conclusion that all of us will in every way follow through this progression. But man, I'm telling you that if you say, I'm going to watch this happen, and I'm going to consciously choose to not engage, you're stepping on the slippery slope. You're choosing to wade into dangerous waters. So be ever so careful. Check your heart. This doesn't always mean, and I want you to hear me on this, that every injustice in the world, you have to be the champion against it. God has built up and equipped people with different gifts and different resources, different callings to do these things, but to just turn a blind eye and say, I'm going to remain indifferent. When we see evil and wickedness and corruption, if that's where you're at, I don't care. Check your heart. I want to give you an example of where, just one example, and there's lots, but one example of where we see this happen even in the church today. Indifference is not neutrality. Here's the example. For a while, there were many Christians and there were many churches that wanted to stay indifferent on the LGBTQ issues. It's a big example. And with these issues, there were many who decided, I don't even want to engage. I don't care. It's fine. And that indifference grew to celebration. I don't care to, this is great. This is no big deal. This is good. And that celebration moved to participation. I want to come around and rally with people and affirm people and where they're at. And we're walking away, but this is a good place. We're good. Let's participate in these things. And it grew from there to becoming a place of activism. Saying we're going to go out and make this happen. We're going to go make this a priority in our world. In the name of Jesus. And the progression takes place over time. And many of us right now, I don't know where all of you are at, but I'm going to guess that many of you are saying, that's pretty rough. It's a shame that happened. And I want to just pause for a moment. Heart check, right? Because our disposition in these issues, with an issue like that, I know it's a polarizing issue. That's why I picked this as an example. Our disposition is to look at it and to look at those churches or Christians that have done what I just said and say, they've got it coming. They have blown it. We would never. And I just want us to pause for a moment and check our hearts. Because on the flip side of that coin, could it not be said that there were many Christians who decided that we wanted to stay indifferent? I don't care. Let people do what people are going to do, and we're not going to engage. And that indifference turned to observing the things that were happening and even some of the sufferings and hardships that people may be undergoing that you may say they've brought it on themselves. Say they had it coming. And you move from indifference to satisfaction. They're reaping the consequences for their behavior. It's good. And you move from there to an active participation where we say, hey, you know what? I'm going to kind of rally around this and actually begin to use some of those hardships, those pains, those things that are going on to actually bring condemnation rather than compassion to these people who are suffering. And from there, moving to just on the same flip side of the coin, to a place of activism where it's like we're going to attack people who are struggling in these ways. And the reason I bring this as an example is because I think that's probably not the right place. And I want you to hear me clearly. In no way am I condoning the sinful activities of people who are struggling. What I am doing is I am calling you to examine your heart. Do you look at people in that particular struggle with malice and anger and hatred in your heart where you say, write them off? Or are you moved in the compassion and mercy of Christ to love those people, to share the hope of Christ with them? Not to beat them while they're down, not to be angry and ridicule, but to share the hope of Christ. The same hope that you embraced in the gospel, that though I am a sinner, Christ died for me. I could not save myself. Christ died for me. My salvation is in Christ. Let me share that hope. Let's call a spade a spade. Sin is sin. We deal with that. But what is your heart towards the hearts and souls and lives of people who, if you could go back, Zach, to that slide with the Proverbs reference, who are being taken away to death and are stumbling to the slaughter. And some of us have said, we're not going to rescue, we're not going to hold back. What we want to do is we want to kick them while they're down, we want to ridicule, we want to jump on the bandwagon, and we want to make this an issue where we're not going to rescue and hold back. And the scriptures will say someday we're going to give an account. And there are countless examples, brothers and sisters, that we could have used. You could fill in the blank with any one of those things. Where's your heart? Your heart is going to dictate in many ways where and how you engage. But to simply sit back and say, you know what? I'm just going to remain neutral. There's no neutral charge in God's courtroom. How will you engage with these issues? How will you engage with sinful patterns and cultural movements? How will you engage with patterns of injustice in our world? You sit by and say, it's not my issue. Or will your heart break for the things that breaks God's heart? Be willing to step in. Rescue those who are being taken away to death. Hold back those who are stumbling to the slaughter. Where's your heartlessness? That's a hard conversation to have with yourself because it's easy to justify. It's easy to stand and say, I'm in the right all the time. And can I just make this observation that just because we fall maybe on the right side of an issue does not necessarily mean that your heart is in the right place. Right? So to be clear, you may fall on the side, you say, the aspirations and the practices of the LGBT community, I'm not there. They're sinful, but where's your heart at? Is your heart to just write people off? Or is your heart to engage and to share the hope and to bring people, to hopefully bring them to salvation and let God do that heart work with them? Examine your own heartlessness. And finally, to move to our last heart check here is to embrace our hope. Embrace our hope. The last third of this book, this short little book, draws our attention to what verse 15 says, for the day of the Lord is near upon all the nations. It's near. Whether from our perspective, our vantage point, or not, the day of the Lord is near for all the nations. And what Obadiah does, he goes on here and he says in verse 15, as you've done, it shall be done to you. You reap what you sow. Your deeds shall return on your own head. For as you've drunk on my holy mountain, so all the nations shall drink continually. They shall drink and swallow and shall be as though they had never been. And what Obadiah is saying is listen, near peak, destruction is going to come on Edom. And what's going to happen is everything that was in that first section. Those things are going to come. Far peak. All the nations will drink continually. They shall drink and swallow. And the end, in that day, on the day of the Lord, is not good news for them. Is not good news. It'll be as though they had never been. And he goes down from there and talks about how there shall be those who escape. And Jacob, he's like, listen, Jacob is going to thrive. Jacob might be beat down right now. He might be plundered. He might be destroyed. His captives might be taken off to the far ends of the earth. But Jacob's not done, and God's going to restore Jacob. And in that day, verse 19 and following, those in the Negeb shall possess Mount Esau. Those of the shepherds or the Shephelah shall possess all the land of the Philistines. They shall possess the land of Ephraim, the land of Samaria. Then Benjamin shall possess Gilead. The exiles of this host of this people of Israel shall possess the land of the Canaanites as far as the Zarephath. And the exiles of Jerusalem who are in Sepharad shall possess the cities of the Negeb. Savior shall go out to the Mount Zion to rule Mount Esau. And notice that last statement. The book ends with an exclamation point. And the kingdom shall be the Lord's. So in the end, the big picture, friends, where's your hope? Because whatever it may be, if you have built your hope on the foundations built by man's hands, in that day we are said that it is going to come crushing down, and it shall be as though it had never been. The one kingdom that will stand will be the Lord's. What are you building your hope on? And will you embrace that hope that is yours in Christ? Because our inheritance is not in how well the United States flourishes. Our inheritance is not in the biggest and best kingdoms that we can build in our own bank accounts and our own achievements. Our inheritance is in eternity in the kingdom of the Lord. And there is nothing that can combat that kingdom. There is nothing that can tear that kingdom down. That's our hope. That's the great inheritance that we look forward to. And so with the awareness of the day of the Lord being near for all the nations, guys, will that move us? And I say this a lot from up here, and I mean it like I want you to hear it in your heart. Will that move us to share the hope that we have? If it is yours, if you know Christ, will you look at the world that is lost and wandering in the darkness and actually say something? Actually engage with people and say, I have a hope. I have a hope that cannot be thwarted. I have a hope that cannot be destroyed. I want to tell you about it. I want to share that hope with you, and open your mouth and move, because while we live in a small town, in a small place, there are many who do not have this hope. There are many that right now are wandering, being taken away to death. There are many who are wandering off to the slaughter. And the uncomfortable reality is far too many Christians are aloof. We don't care. We are not moved to engage. We've chosen to remain indifferent. So in the end, I wonder if the ultimate failure won't be offending people with the gospel. I wonder if the ultimate failure will be that far too many never said anything at all. Where's your heart? Expose your own haughtiness. Examine your heartlessness. And then cling to the hope that you have in Christ. He's the answer. He's the King, and He will rule for all eternity.